In the silent, crystalline dawn of prehistory, before the first drop of human sweat hit the soil and before the concept of law had a name, there was a pause. The opening movement of the biblical narrative presents a cosmic anomaly, a day unlike all others. It was a day God himself set apart, not out of a need for recuperation, nor because the mechanics of the universe had exhausted its creator, but because he chose to stop. In our modern age of relentless 24/7 connectivity, where the global economy never sleeps and human value is increasingly measured by digital throughput, this ancient pause serves as a radical geopolitical and existential critique. What if the most sacred commandment in Scripture was never intended as a rigid cage of rules? What if the Sabbath was actually a manifesto of sovereignty over time itself? This question sits at the epicenter of a historic tension that has shaped civilizations, sparked theological wars, and eventually led to a confrontation that would change the course of Western history. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Sabbath, we must peel back the layers of religious tradition and look at the raw mechanics of the beginning. Genesis 1 unfolds with the precision of a high-stakes documentary, a symphony of light, darkness, sea, and life. It is an ordered rhythm of forming and filling. But the climax is not the creation of man, it is the cessation of work. Genesis 2:13 records that on the seventh day, God finished his work and rested. In the original Hebrew, this rest, Shabbat, doesn't imply a collapse into fatigue. It is the rest of a king who has secured his borders. It is the rest of an artist who has stepped back from the canvas because the masterpiece is complete. It was a declaration of sufficiency. God looked at the totality of existence and pronounced it finished. Then he did something unprecedented. He sanctified time. He didn't sanctify a temple, a mountain, or a person first. He made a segment of time holy. This primordial rest established a rhythm into the very fabric of creation, a software update for the human soul before the system was ever corrupted by sin. There were no penalties yet, no stone tablets, and no threats of execution. It was a pattern, not a pressure. This tells us a profound truth that modern economics often ignores. Rest was not created to fix broken, burnt-out people. It was designed to sustain whole ones. It was an insurance policy against the idolatry of production. Before the thorns of toil emerged, the sacred pause was already there. Yet this leads us to a darker inquiry. If the Sabbath was born in such purity, how did it transform into a weapon of legalism? Why would a gift meant to bring life eventually be enforced with the shadow of death? The shift from gift to law didn't begin with a decree. It began with a profound cultural amnesia. When humanity fell, they didn't just lose a garden, they lost the ability to trust the rhythm. Work, which was meant to be a partnership with the divine, devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. By the time we find the descendants of Abraham in the book of Exodus, the concept of the sacred pause has been systematically erased by an imperial machine. For 4 centuries, Israel existed not as a nation, but as a resource. They were the engine of the Egyptian economy, a population of laborers whose worth was calculated solely in the tally of bricks produced and fields tilled. In the eyes of Pharaoh, there was no holy time, there was only the quota. This period represents the first recorded instance of total industrial exploitation. The Egyptians appointed taskmasters to afflict the Israelites with heavy burdens. In this geopolitical landscape, Pharaoh functioned as the anti-Sabbath king. His power was predicated on the denial of rest. To Pharaoh, a person who stops is a person who thinks. A person who rests is a person who might remember they are free. When Moses finally confronts this superpower with the demand for liberation, Pharaoh's reaction is a classic tactic of authoritarian control. He increases the workload. He labels the desire for rest as laziness and rebellion. He understands that if you keep a population exhausted, you keep them compliant. Rest in a world of slavery is the most dangerous form of resistance. Therefore, the battle for the Exodus was not just about geographic relocation. It was a war over the ownership of time. Who has the right to say stop? As the plagues began to dismantle the Egyptian gods, the ultimate goal was to reclaim the human soul from the relentless grind of the empire. The exodus from Egypt was more than a political migration. It was a mass psychological recalibration. As the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, they left behind the whips of the taskmasters, but they carried the mindset of the enslaved within them. A people who have been defined by their output for 400 years do not know how to be human in the absence of a quota. They were entering a wilderness where there were no brick kilns, yet their internal clocks were still tuned to the frantic pace of Pharaoh's empire. Recognizing this, the divine strategy for nation building did not begin with a constitution or a military expansion. It began with the management of hunger and the reclamation of time. Before the thunder of Sinai, God introduced a radical economic experiment, the manna. This bread from heaven served as the ultimate training ground for trust. It appeared daily, a fragile provision that could not be hoarded or commodified. In a move that defied every instinct of survival learned in Egypt, God commanded that they gather only what they needed for the day. If they tried to build a surplus, the very foundation of Egyptian power, the bread rotted. This was a direct strike against the theology of accumulation. But the true test came on the sixth day. They were told to gather a double portion because the seventh day would be a vacuum of production. No manna would fall. For a former slave, the idea of not working to secure one's food is not a relief. It is a terrifying risk. Exodus 16 records that some, driven by the ghost of Pharaoh's scarcity, went out on the seventh day anyway. They found nothing. God's response was a poignant question of identity. How long will you refuse to keep my commands? This was the moment the Sabbath shifted from a cosmic pattern into a survival necessity. When the Israelites finally reached the base of Mount Sinai, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of a new covenant. Out of the 10 foundational laws etched into stone, the Sabbath commandment stands out as a massive block of text, the longest and most detailed of the decalogues. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This was not just a moral suggestion, it was a treaty. Unlike the laws against murder or theft, which appealed to a universal human conscience, the Sabbath appealed to the very architecture of the universe. It reached backward past the trauma of Egypt to the rest of the Creator. By observing the Sabbath, Israel was declaring that they were no longer defined by what they could produce for a king, but by their relationship with the King of Kings. However, as the law solidified, the stakes were raised to a level that baffles the modern mind. In Exodus 31, the decree becomes stark. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. To the contemporary observer, this seems like a monstrous overreaction. Why execute a man for gathering sticks on a Saturday? To understand this, one must view the Sabbath through the lens of national security and spiritual allegiance. In the ancient Near East, your calendar was your confession. To break the Sabbath was not just a personal lapse in time management, it was an act of high treason. It was a public declaration that one did not trust God to provide, signaling a return to the slavery thinking of Egypt. If the community allowed the Pharaoh mindset to take root in even one person, the entire experiment of a free, trusting nation was at risk. The severity of the punishment was a reflection of the weight of the freedom they were protecting. The Sabbath had become a sign, a boundary marker that separated Israel from the surrounding nations. While the neighboring empires of Mesopotamia and Canaan were locked in a perpetual cycle of appeasing capricious gods through endless labor and ritual, Israel was the only nation on earth that had guaranteed rest, written into its DNA. This created a unique geopolitical friction. In an era where military and economic might were the only currencies of value, a nation that shut down its economy every 7 days was committing a kind of recurring economic suicide. Yet it was this very act of weakness that was meant to be their greatest strength. It was a weekly demonstration that their survival was not a product of their own striving, but of a divine guarantee. As the centuries progressed, the Sabbath evolved into a complex socio-political engine. It wasn't just for the elites or the priests. The law explicitly included the servant, the immigrant, and even the livestock. This was the world's first universal labor law. It leveled the social hierarchy once a week, reminding the master that he did not own his servant's time, and reminding the laborer that his dignity was not tied to his tools. But with this institutionalization came a new danger. The Sabbath was becoming a marker of us versus them. It was no longer just a day of rest, it was becoming a day of surveillance. The transition from a gift of freedom to a test of loyalty was underway, and the heavy atmosphere of legalism was beginning to gather like a storm. As Israel transitioned from a nomadic tribe to a settled monarchy, the Sabbath became the bedrock of their national identity, but the purity of that rhythm began to erode under the pressures of power and greed. The prophets of the Old Testament emerged as the fierce whistleblowers of a decaying spiritual economy. They observed a disturbing trend. The external rituals of the Sabbath were being meticulously maintained, while the internal heart of the law was being liquidated for profit. Through the prophet Isaiah, the divine critique became a scathing indictment of performative holiness. In Isaiah 58, God confronts a nation that fasts, prays, and keeps the holy days with precision, yet simultaneously exploits its workforce and ignores the plight of the vulnerable. This is the great prophetic tension. A Sabbath observed by hands that are stained with the blood of social injustice is not a Sabbath at all. It is a hollow mockery. The geopolitical consequences of this spiritual drift were catastrophic. The prophets warned that the land itself was being denied its rest. The Mosaic law had commanded not only a weekly rest for people but a sabbatical year for the soil. A radical ecological and economic reset every 7 years where debts were canceled, and the earth was allowed to breathe. But the elites of Jerusalem, driven by the same Pharaoh logic of endless accumulation, ignored these cycles. They viewed the fallow year as a loss of GDP rather than a gain in trust. Jeremiah stood at the city gates, pleading with the people to stop treating the Sabbath as a day for commercial logistics. He warned that when a nation prioritizes production over the sacred pause, it eventually loses its right to the land. The breaking point arrived with the Babylonian conquest. In 586 BC, Jerusalem was razed, and the survivors were dragged into exile. The historian of 2 Chronicles offers a stunning post-mortem on the fall of the kingdom. The land was finally enjoying its Sabbaths while the people sat in chains in Babylon. What Israel refused to give voluntarily, the earth reclaimed by force. For 70 years the fields of Judah lay silent, a physical manifestation of a broken covenant. In the trauma of exile, the Jewish people underwent a profound transformation. They realized that their disregard for the Sabbath was not a minor technicality. It was a symptom of a heart that no longer trusted its creator. They learned in the dust of Babylon that a people who cannot stop working will eventually be forced to stop by the weight of their own exhaustion and judgment. When the exiles finally returned to rebuild Jerusalem, they were a people defined by a never-again mentality. They had seen the price of disobedience, and they were determined to build a spiritual fortress that no enemy and no temptation could breach. This birthed the era of the fences. To ensure that no one even came close to breaking the Sabbath, the religious leaders began to construct elaborate layers of oral law, known as the Mishnah. They categorized work into 39 forbidden activities, ranging from tying a knot to extinguishing a lamp. These were not meant to be burdens, they were intended as safeguards. But over centuries the safeguards became the substance. The Sabbath, once a day of expansive freedom from the grind, was becoming a minefield of microscopic regulations. By the time of the Second Temple period, the atmosphere surrounding the Sabbath was one of intense scrutiny. It had become a visible metric of a person's standing in the community. Neighbors watch neighbors, the elite watch the masses. The question was no longer, is your soul finding rest in God, but rather, how many steps have you walked today? This shift represented a significant psychological pivot in the history of faith. Holiness was being reduced to compliance, and the sign of the covenant was being used as a tool of social control. The Sabbath had become a burden heavy enough to crush the very people it was meant to carry. It was in this high-tension environment, where the law had become a wall rather than a window, that a young rabbi from Nazareth stepped onto the scene, ready to dismantle the architecture of fear. The entrance of Jesus onto the public stage was not merely a religious event. It was a structural disruption of the social and theological status quo. He did not encounter a vacuum, but a highly pressurized system where the Sabbath had become the ultimate litmus test for Jewish identity under Roman occupation. In a world where the Roman eagles loomed over Jerusalem, the Sabbath was the one territory the empire could not conquer. Consequently, the religious authorities guarded it with a ferocity born of both devotion and trauma. Into this environment Jesus walked with a deliberate, almost provocative, disregard for the fences that had been built around the law. He did not challenge the Sabbath in the abstract. He challenged it through flesh and blood, choosing the sacred day as the primary backdrop for his most controversial acts of healing. The Gospels record a series of Sabbath confrontations that read like a legal drama. In one instance, Jesus enters a synagogue and finds a man with a withered hand. The atmosphere is thick with surveillance. The text notes that the leaders were watching him closely. They weren't looking for a miracle, they were looking for a violation. In their meticulously coded world, healing was classified as work, unless the patient's life was in immediate peril. A withered hand was a chronic inconvenience, not a fatal emergency, and therefore, according to the tradition, it could wait until Sunday. Jesus, sensing the coldness of this logic, posed a question that struck at the very foundations of the law. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to kill? The silence that followed was an indictment. By healing the man instantly and publicly, Jesus was asserting that the cessation of labor was never meant to be the cessation of mercy. The tension escalated further in the incident at the pool of Bethesda. Jesus heals a man who had been paralyzed for 38 years, a lifetime of stagnation. He tells the man, "Pick up your mat and walk." This was a double violation in the eyes of the observers. Not only was the healing performed on the Sabbath, but the man was now carrying a burden through the city streets. When the religious police intercepted the man, they didn't celebrate his mobility. They interrogated his methodology. Their focus was on the mat, not the miracle. This reveals a profound psychological shift. The law had become more real to them than the person the law was intended to serve. When Jesus was confronted for this, his response was even more radical. He didn't argue from the perspective of a scholar. He argued from the perspective of a son, stating, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." This was the ultimate theological hand grenade. Jesus was claiming a unique, divine synchronicity with the Creator. He was suggesting that while God rested from the work of creation on the seventh day, he never rested from the work of redemption and providence. If God continues to sustain the universe and heal the broken on the Sabbath, then Jesus, as his representative, had the authority to do the same. This was not just a debate about rules, it was a claim of lordship. He capped this claim with the revolutionary statement, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." With these words, Jesus flipped the entire religious hierarchy on its head. The Sabbath was a servant meant to bless humanity, not a master meant to enslave it. The final breaking point came when Jesus' disciples were seen plucking heads of grain as they walked through a field on the Sabbath. To the Pharisees, this was harvesting, a forbidden labor. Jesus responded by pointing to King David, who in a moment of necessity ate the sacred bread of the presence. He was teaching them that human need always supersedes ritual technicality. He concluded with the definitive declaration, "The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." By claiming lordship over the day, Jesus was doing more than asking for a reform. He was announcing that he was the destination toward which the Sabbath had always been pointing. The holy time was now being eclipsed by a holy person. This set the stage for the final act of the drama, where the rhythm of rest and the reality of death would finally collide. The collision between the old guard and the new covenant reached its zenith in the shadow of a Roman cross. To the religious authorities, executing Jesus was an act of preserving the sanctity of their law and the stability of their nation. There is a deep tragic irony in the timing of the crucifixion. The men who conspired to kill the Lord of the Sabbath were in a frantic rush to finish the execution before the sun set on Friday. They were desperate to ensure that the bodies did not remain on the crosses during the Sabbath, fearing that the presence of the dead would defile the day of rest. They were meticulously following the rules of the sign, while literally murdering the reality the sign pointed to. As Jesus breathed his last, declaring, "It is finished," the work of redemption was complete. The narrative then enters a profound cosmic silence. As the Sabbath began on that Friday evening, Jesus rested in the tomb. This was the ultimate seventh day. Just as the Creator rested in Genesis after the work of creation, the Redeemer rested in the earth after the work of recreation. For 24 hours the universe held its breath. There were no miracles, no sermons, and no movement. In the silence of the tomb, the Sabbath was being transformed from a day of anticipation into a day of fulfillment. When the dawn broke on the first day of the week, the morning of the resurrection, the old world had passed away. The eighth day had begun. This was not just a new day on the calendar. It was the birth of a new creation, a reality where the rest God intended was no longer a temporary pause from labor, but an eternal state of being. The early church, comprised of both Jews who had lived under the law and Gentiles who had never known it, had to navigate this seismic shift. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Colossians, provided the definitive theological framework. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you with regard to a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. This is the breaking news of the New Testament. The shadow is not the substance. If you are standing in the sunlight, you no longer need to study the silhouette. The Sabbath pointed toward a rest that was deeper than a 24-hour cycle. It pointed to a rest from the work of trying to justify oneself before a holy God. In this light, Jesus did not end the Sabbath law in the sense of destroying it. He fulfilled it by becoming it. The author of Hebrews explains that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. But this rest is entered through faith, not through a calendar. It is a rest from the labor of performance and the toil of earning one's worth. In the modern world, this message is more relevant than ever. We live in a global culture that is essentially a digital Egypt, a system that demands constant production, constant visibility, and constant striving. We are told that we are what we produce, and if we stop, we vanish. Against this backdrop, the rest of Christ is a radical, subversive act of freedom. It is the choice to believe that the work is already finished, that our value is secured by the Creator, and that we are allowed to stop. The story of the Sabbath is the story of humanity's search for home. It began in a garden of perfect rhythm, was codified in a wilderness of training, was distorted in a kingdom of legalism, and was finally personified in a man who invited the weary and heavy-laden to come to him for rest. The Sabbath was never about the day, it was about the heart. It was a weekly reminder that we are not slaves to the machine, the economy, or our own anxieties. We are invited to step out of the frantic pursuit of more, and into the quiet confidence of enough. Jesus did not come to give us a new set of rules for the seventh day. He came to be the seventh day for us. In him, the sacred pause becomes a permanent peace. The journey from the law of the Sabbath to the Lord of the Sabbath is the journey from fear to freedom, a journey that ends not with a ticking clock, but with the eternal invitation to finally, truly stop.